To this podcast, the Heidelcast.
It's a Heidel Minicast. And now, Scott Clark.
The crisis of the hour, Christ and culture.
If the Heidelcast helps you, won't you help us keep it going? Please make the coffer clink by clicking on the PayPal link or by sending a check to Heidelberg Reformation Association, 1637 East Valley Parkway, number 391, Escondido, California, 92027.
If you checked out the Heidel video page, heidelblog.net/Heidel video. There may be no more pressing issue before Christians as individuals and the visible church as a corporate body than the question of Christ and culture. Much of what concerns us all now goes back in one way or another to the question of how to relate Christ to culture. In his 1951 classic Christ and Culture, H. Richard Niebuhr identified three models for relating Christ to culture: Christ against culture, Christ of culture, and Christ above culture. For the first, Niebuhr thought about the 3rd century Latin father Tertullian, who famously wrote, "What has Athens to do with Jerusalem?" In the second, we might think of those theological liberals, and too many evangelicals, who want to synthesize Christianity with the prevailing culture. In the third model, there were said to be three subsets. Trevin Wax gives us a helpful survey of the options Niebuhr presented for his exemplars of the synthetic approach under Christ above culture. Niebuhr pointed to Justin Martyr, Clement of Alexandria, and Thomas Aquinas. For his exemplars of the paradoxical view, he highlighted Luther and Kierkegaard. As for his examples of the transformational view, he pointed to Augustine, Calvin, and F.D. Maurice. Niebuhr's taxonomy is a useful starting place, but it's a poor stopping place, since, as in all such taxonomies, there are ways in which it works for pedagogical purposes and ways in which it does not. It's too simplistic. For example, Tertullian's relations to the prevailing Roman culture were more complicated than Niebuhr was able to present. Tertullian was as amusing and biting and persuasive as he was because he was deeply influenced by the rhetorical culture of his time, and yet, because of his profound Christian commitment, he recognized fundamental ways in which Christianity was at odds with the prevailing culture of his time. When he asked what Jerusalem had to do with Athens, he was asking a very important question. He went on to say that we do not need Zeno's porch, that is pagan philosophy, because we have Solomon's porch, that is God's word. Now, that is just brilliant. And he was right. He wasn't saying that we don't need to know pagan philosophy, but that we do not need to rely on it. However much we might admire Zeno or any other pagan, for example, Plato or Aristotle, fundamentally, Christianity gives a competing account of the origin of the world, the meaning of the world, the significance of humanity, sin, salvation, and last things. Similarly, we could criticize the notion that Thomas was synthesizing Aristotelian philosophy with Christianity. And this gets complicated, at least at some times. Reading Thomas, I have thought that his debt to Neoplatonism via Pseudo-Dionysius is more interesting and a more important question. Was Justin really synthesizing Greek ideas with Christianity? He made use of Greek vocabulary, but so did the Apostle John. To be sure, Justin's Logos Christology is not exactly John's, and we should prefer the Apostle John to Justin on that question. As for treating Augustine and Calvin as transformational figures, well, that's just anachronism. Certainly they put to use their considerable learning in the classics in the service of Christ, but plundering the Egyptians, which was Augustine's language, and adopting a neo-Ciceronian Latin style, that's what Calvin did, isn't exactly transformational in nature. There's another way of thinking about the relations of Christ to culture. But before we get to Christ and culture, we have to get straight our understanding of nature and grace. And there have been historically three views among Christians. One, grace perfects nature. And the Latin for that, just in case you were wondering, is gratia non tollat naturam, sed perficiet. Second is grace obliterates nature. Gratia tollit naturam. And third is grace renews nature. And again, it's essentially the same as the first with some minor differences. So you could arguably say there are really only two views. Either grace perfects nature or grace destroys nature. The first famously came from Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica 1a 1:8, where he was answering the question whether theology is a matter of argument, that is, whether reason has any role in theology, and if so, what. He first answers the objection that argument has no place in theology, that is, it is a matter of sheer authority. The second objection is twofold, that if theology is a matter of argument, then the argument is either from authority or from reason, and both are unfitting. His initial response is to quote Titus 1:9 to the effect that it's part of the pastor's job to persuade people, which entails making reasoned arguments. His more complete argument is that we do not argue to principles, but from them. More evidence that what you may have heard and read about Thomas may not be entirely accurate. And thus we argue from the general to the specific. The famous saying occurs in his response to the second objection, and it's a lengthy quotation, but it's worth reading. And I quote, "But sacred doctrine makes use even of human reason, not indeed to prove faith, for thereby the merit of faith would come to an end, but to make clear other things that are put forward in this doctrine. Since therefore grace does not destroy nature, but perfects it, natural reason should minister to faith." That expression is very important, as the natural bent of the will ministers to charity. Just if I can explain that quickly. When he says reason ministers to faith, he's saying that reason serves faith. Faith does not serve reason. That's really important because sometimes, and I've heard it done, Thomas is represented or misrepresented as saying the opposite. But I continue the quote. "Hence the apostle says, bringing into captivity every understanding unto the obedience of Christ. Hence, sacred doctrine makes use also of the authority of philosophers in those questions in which they are able to know the truth by natural reason, as Paul quotes a saying of Aratus, quoting here, as some of your own poets said, for we are also his offspring." That's Acts 17:28. Nevertheless, sacred doctrine makes use of the authorities as extrinsic and probable arguments, but properly used the authority of the canonical scriptures as an incontrovertible proof, and the authority of the doctors of the church, which is a reference to Ambrose, Augustine, Gregory, and Jerome, as one that may be properly used, yet merely as probable. And I've modified that a little bit from the Dominican Fathers. Translation. For Thomas, nature is not able to attain to the supernatural. Thus, for Adam to have entered into the state of blessedness at the end of his probation, he needed the aid of grace. If you want to know more about how the Reformed dealt with this idea, take a look at Harrison Perkins' wonderful book. It's a very, I think, challenging book. It was for me anyway. And the title is Righteous by Design, Covenantal Merit and Adam's Original Integrity. Again, that's Harrison Perkins' Righteous by Design, published by Mentor in 2024. This is technical stuff and challenging. In fact, this book changed my opinion of Thomas, so I want to be a little careful about what I say here, because sometimes what is reported to have been Thomas's view, according to Perkins, and I think Harrison does a good job of making his case, isn't really Thomas as much as it was 19th century Neo-Thomism, and they weren't even necessarily particularly faithful to Thomas. But at any rate, we affirm, right, that human beings were created, Adam was created good, that is, in righteousness and true holiness, and able by nature to know and love God and neighbor, and thereby to enter into a state of blessedness. That's Heidelberg Catechism 6, and I'm thinking about Canons of Dort, the third and fourth head of Doctrine 1, and also Rejection of Errors, third and fourth head 2, and Belgic Confession, Article 14. So, as to what we make of Thomas, that's one thing, but for the Reformed, we agree that our fundamental problem is not finitude, but sin.
Ladies and gentlemen, Scott Clark.
The Anabaptists had an over-realized eschatology, and because they did, they essentially denied nature as a category. For them, grace and salvation are such that nature is essentially wiped out. So, where for Thomas and the Reformed, grace perfects nature, And then we have to figure out exactly what Thomas means by perfect. And in this case, I think Harrison has, as I say, helped me to understand what Thomas was doing with that. There was a time when I thought it meant to deify, and I'm not sure really that's the case anymore. But for the Anabaptists, I'm sure that they thought about grace just wiping out nature. So I think I would make two categories. On the one hand, I'd say Thomas and the Reformed, and not just Thomas, but other theologians as well, believe that grace renews nature. That's what perfects really means, I think. And the Anabaptists, grace wipes out nature. And one of the reasons I say that is because it's not hard to find Reformed Orthodox writers in the 17th century complaining about the Anabaptist doctrine of grace wiping out nature. And in response, they quoted that saying from Thomas. At any rate, American evangelical theology, piety, and practice has been deeply influenced by this way of relating nature and grace. And so, even though they're not aware of it, it permeates evangelical thinking, and it affects the way people look at culture. It affects their doctrine of humanity, their Christology, and their ethics. And practically, it means that there's little sense for a lot of evangelicals, and actually for some Reformed people, particularly for Neo-Kuyperians, and I know because I was one, of the created order or natural law. In the Neo-Kuyperianism, grace more or less wipes out nature too. I don't think it's intentional. I just think that's an outcome of some assumptions and premises. It's also the case that Karl Barth's rejection of Thomas, as he called it, arch heresy in Nature and Grace, and Louis Berkhoff quotes it actually in his Systematic Theology, that led to untold chaos and error in modern liberal and evangelical, and even in, as I say, some ostensibly conservative Reformed circles. The classical Reformed approach, as I said earlier, was to reject the Anabaptist view, and they did so by quoting the very saying that I quoted from Thomas Aquinas.
Heidelcast.
The Reformed, in so doing, were asserting the goodness of creation and the existence of creation as a category, which was essential to their doctrine of the covenant of works. And further, because they believe that grace renews nature, you don't find them talking about things like cosmic redemption or cultural transformation in this life prior to the return of Christ. And that's why you don't see them talking about, Christian politics or Christian this, Christian that. In other words, you wouldn't see them talking about, for example, as people do now, Christian football, Christian softball, Christian plumbing, or that sort of thing. One corollary to this is the recovery of the category of secular. Tragically, the adjective secular has taken on very negative connotations. And my argument is it shouldn't be so among us. Bernard Lewis, as Darrell Hart points out in his wonderful book, A Secular Faith, says that it was Christians who gave us the category of the secular. I'm going to say that again. It was Christians in the 2nd century who gave us this category, and it wasn't pejorative. In the pagan Roman world, everything was religious. All the food was devoted to the gods. As Paul said, however, we're free to eat meat offered to the idols as long as our hosts do not say to us, this meal is devoted to the gods. Take a look at 1 Corinthians 10:28. At that point, the meal is no longer a common secular meal, but is now an overtly religious meal. And as Christians, we may not share in a pagan feast. We may not drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. See 1 Corinthians 10:21. Well, see, really, 1 Corinthians chapters 8 through 10. Provided, however, that it is an ordinary, common, secular meal, we are free to eat or not to eat as conscience and wisdom dictate. In the New Testament, we see no movement to redeem or transform secular cultural practices or politics. The New Testament Christians and the early post-apostolic Christians sought to live quietly. See, for example, 1 Thessalonians 4:11, 2 Thessalonians 3:12, and 1 Timothy 2:2. They worked assiduously to stay out of the way, to be left alone, and so much so that when pagans spread false rumors about them, they had to be tortured by the authorities to be made to reveal where they met for worship and what they did there. They were not, as some transformationalists like to say, quietists or pietists. The Christians in the New Testament and in the early post-apostolic church were defending the faith to pagans, but not to the mob. The literature from the period shows them engaging the culture, but it doesn't show them seeking to transform it or to dominate it. Both Paul, for example, Philippians 3:20, and the epistle to Diognetus about AD 150, taught that we live in a twofold kingdom. Paul invoked his civil rights as a Roman citizen, but only after he was beaten and when it was to the advantage of his mission. He spoke to the powers of this world, but he spoke about a kingdom whose builder and maker is God, whose kingdom shall have no end. To the Philippians, who lived in a Roman retirement town, and you'd know that if you're listening to the current series on Sundays, Have This Mind, which is a study of Philippians, he wrote that however valuable their Roman citizenship was, which had often been purchased at the cost of their own blood, our citizenship is in heaven, is what he said. And that citizenship was purchased at the cost of Christ's precious blood. We don't see Paul or any other apostle giving policy advice to Caesar. We see the same approach in Ad Diognetum, or to Diognetus, where he argued that we live in two spheres simultaneously. And I quote, this is from chapter 5. The Christians live in their own countries, but only as aliens. They participate in everything as citizens and endure everything as foreigners. Every foreign country is their fatherland, and every fatherland is foreign. They marry like everyone else and have children, but they do not expose their offspring. They share their food, but not their wives. They are in the flesh, but they do not live according to the flesh. They live on earth, but their citizenship is in heaven. They obey the established laws. Indeed, in their private lives, they transcend the laws. They love everyone, and by everyone they are persecuted. They are unknown, yet they are condemned. They are put to death, yet they are brought to life. They are poor, yet they make many rich. They are in need of everything, yet they abound in everything. They are dishonored, yet they are glorified in their dishonor. They are slandered, yet they are vindicated. They are cursed, yet they bless. They are insulted, yet they offer respect. When they do good, they are punished as evildoers, and when they are punished, they rejoice as though brought to life. By the Jews they are assaulted as foreigners, and by the Greeks they are persecuted. Yet those who hate them are unable to give a reason for their hostility. That's, again, from Ad Diognetum, or to Diognetus, 5, verses 5 through 17. And that's Michael Holmes' translation in the Apostolic Fathers' Greek texts and English translations. It's the updated edition from 1999. It's a wonderful edition, and I commend to you the reading of this wonderful treatise, To Diognetus. So, I submit that this approach to Christ and culture does not fit Niebuhr's taxonomy. It's not transformational. It's not merely oppositional. It's certainly not of the culture, and yet, as the writer himself says, they are in the culture. We Christians are in the midst of pagans. We are neighbors to them. We share the streets and markets in common. We eat the same food. We share the same language, but not the same gods. We conduct a normal human life under the laws of creation, like everyone else. But we do so with an eye to the consummation of the age, and under the lordship of Christ, the only Savior, and the reigning King of all.
Call or text now 760-618-1563.
There are two extremes to be avoided here. One is quietism, which is fleeing culture, and the other is dominion, and that's conquering culture. The medieval monks tried to flee the cultures of their day, but in fact, they only took it with them into the monasteries. They created little villages of sinners, fleeing the obligations of family and community. The Protestants rejected world flight as an approach to culture. In the early 16th century, the Anabaptists, disgusted with the state of the established churches, rebelled and set up alternative villages and churches, which they sought to make entirely pure in this world before the return of Christ. Most of them envisioned that Christ was returning quickly to establish a 1,000-year earthly kingdom in which Christ would reign visibly over all his enemies. Until then, however, when they were not taking over cities, for example, Minster, or leading the peasant revolt, which involved 20,000 soldiers, they fled the culture. In other words, it was their way or the highway. It's important for American Christians to know a little bit about this movement since it has been deeply influential on American evangelical Christianity since the early 19th century. And for more on this, see the essay Magic and Noise, Reformed Christianity in Sisters America in Always Reformed. And you can find that at heidelblog.net/publications. In our time, there's a movement among some Spanish speakers in the USA, and it's called La Reconquista, and it seeks to take back portions of the American Southwest for Spanish-speaking peoples, to whom they refer as La Raza. There's an analogous movement in some quarters of the Reformed world. After rejecting the ancient Christian and classical Reformed approach to Christ and culture, and after rejecting the classical Reformed distinction between the sacred and the secular, it seeks to reconquer America for Christ. Like the Anabaptists, it too has an over-realized eschatology, and like the Anabaptists, it's impatient. And like them, it sometimes creates small communities with an expectation that those communities will help usher in a glorious, visible manifestation of the power of Christ on the earth. And for more on this, see the Heidelblog resources on theonomy and Christian reconstruction. It's true, Christ is sovereign over all things, but He has placed Christians and the visible church in this fallen world as a witness to Him and to His kingdom. We live, as Diognetus says, alongside the pagans, but we are not of them. We are against their understanding of the world and their religion, and yet we are not at war with them. We seek to live at peace with them, and peacefully, graciously, win as many of them to Christ and to His kingdom as God's sovereign grace allows. We all live in a culture. Many of us live in multiple cultures simultaneously without even realizing it. We're all influenced by our surrounding cultures. Before Christians can decide how to navigate this life, how to live with our pagan neighbors, how to be truly Christian, in the midst of profoundly anti-Christian cultures, we have to become aware of the relationship of Christ to culture. And what a great question this is. We need to ask ourselves, how are we being influenced by our culture? How are we unintentionally baptizing the surrounding culture and calling it Christianity? One way this happens is when we set as a goal not the kingdom of heaven, but a nice middle-class American family with nice middle-class lives in the here and now. There's nothing wrong with nice middle-class suburban life, but that's not the kingdom, and it's not Christianity. If we become aware of this and begin to see the difference, we will be taking important steps toward working through the problem of Christ and culture for ourselves.
Thanks for listening. Tune in tomorrow for more from the Heidelcast, brought to you by Heidelberg Reformation Association.org. Don't forget, when the coin in the coffer clinks, the cost of bandwidth shrinks. Copyright Heidelberg Reformation Association. All rights reserved. This is a Heidel Media production.
The best podcast, the Heidelcast.